Okay, I am so excited about this video, guys. Jay Bradley, Craft Whiskey Boys. We are doing Whiskey University, and this is Indian whiskey versus Scotch whiskey, and there is some stark differences. There's a lot of similarities, but some stark differences that make it quite challenging for Indian producers to make fine whiskeys. I'm going to touch on it all in the moment, but it's really, really interesting, so stay tuned and watch how this all plays out. All right, so first things first, obviously Indian whiskey, there's two types of Indian whiskey. There's a single malt, kind of more expensive, like the Scotch style. And then there's the stuff where like 92% of the whole whiskey market is what they drink. And that's whiskey is actually, India's the largest whiskey market in the world, but it's not really exported outside India, and the reason for that is because internationally it's not allowed to be called whiskey because it's not the same as the rest of the whiskey around the world. It doesn't follow the same practices or standards. To give you an example, the majority of Indian whiskey is like a blend, and it's got about 5, maybe 10% of actual kind of malted whiskey in it. And then the rest of it is actually made by fermented molasses, so it's made much like a rum. So if they were to sell it anywhere else in the world, they'd legally probably have to call it either a rum or like a spirit drink. They couldn't call it whiskey. But there is a couple of producers now, the likes of Amrut and Rampur and a couple others, there's like I think 3 or 4 of them now, that do a single malt much like a Scotch. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to talk about Indian whiskey on the higher end, not the kind of stuff that is drunk all across India in like millions and millions of cases. I think it's like 32 million cases for the top whiskey brand, which is, I believe, is Officer's Choice. It's phenomenal. I mean, it outsells vodka is the largest selling spirit in the world outside of that, given like the likes of Smirnoff. And Officer's Choice is right there doing the same type of volume, just one Indian whiskey brand, let alone the rest of them. So phenomenal amount drank, but we're not going to talk about that one. We're going to talk about traditional. All right, so here's the thing. In India, when we're talking about the likes of the Amrut and those types of whiskies, they're all traditionally following the Scotch model. They're traditionally double distilled. They're all 100% malted barley. If they go for peated, now here's the thing, for India to grow barley, they need to do that right up in the northern borders, up near kind of Nepal and China. Now, if they wanted to peat their whiskey, which is, the problem is there's not much peat in India, right? They don't have peat there, so they have to buy it in from Scotland or Ireland and get the barley peated over there. So traditionally it's all the same. They mature in oak, they go for the 3 years because they have to. If the likes of Amrut or Rampur or any of these Indian brands want to sell internationally as a whiskey, they must follow the same regulations as the likes of Scotch and Irish. So 3 years, oak, malted barley, all that. But here's where it gets super interesting. It is warmer in India. Now, in the places like where Amrut is, Bangalore, those types of places, it's about 30, 32 degrees in the summer, so it's not stupidly hot. It's kind of similar to maybe Kentucky, but it is a lot hotter than it gets in Scotland and Ireland. So it will mature quicker, and here's why. The humidity in India is basically zero. There's no real humidity there, so it's a very dry climate. Whereas in Scotland, with all the rain, and same in Ireland, there's lots of high humidity, so it's a very humid climate. And here's why this matters. In the likes of India, it's a big problem for the distillers there, to be honest, is they will mature a whiskey 6 times quicker than they can in Scotland. So a 3-year-old Indian whiskey is kind of akin to like an 18-year-old Scottish whiskey. And here's why. It's not just because of the heat. It's because of the humidity, right? What happens is in India is when it's dry and it's a dry climate, it basically extracts, the angel share takes more of the water over the alcohol out of the barrel. So when the water goes out, the actual ABV goes up. So if you're maturing whiskey in Scotland and you've got a barrel of whiskey, every year the angel share, the evaporation happens, and it takes a little bit, maybe 2% of that whiskey, and it goes down and down and down. And every year the alcohol by volume actually goes down because it's so humid, there's so much water outside in the air, that goes into the barrel, and that's what brings that ABV down in the likes of Scotland and Ireland. But in India, there is no water in the air, it's really dry. Right? So what happens is that the water in the barrel goes outside and it condenses the alcohol, and the alcohol volume goes up. So for them to get a whiskey to like 18 years old is an extraordinary challenge. It's just really, really difficult to do. They have to really barrel at a much lower ABV to be able to do that. So Indian whiskey, I'll give you an example of this. So the Amrut in 2000, and I think I have a bottle of it. It is the Amaret Fusion. I'm not sure if it was this specific one, but one of the Amarets, and it could be this Fusion. In 2010 or 2011, Jim Murray named this the 3rd best whiskey on earth. So they know what they're doing over there in India. They're making some great whiskeys. Obviously, we all know about Scottish whiskey. It's a colder climate, so you need to mature it for much longer. It's high humidity, so you know, only oak. You can't use any other type of wood. Must be 100% malted barley if we're talking about single malt from one distillery. When we say the word single, we mean from one single distillery, and traditionally double distilled. So we all kind of know Scotch, and I've done a number of videos on Scotch versus something else. So if you haven't seen any of those, watch them when I go into more detail about Scotch. But in this one specifically, we're kind of comparing Indian to Scotch. So it's really important to kind of touch on these points, and it's so interesting what goes on there because of the climate, but it's producing phenomenal whiskeys. We're actually going to be doing a 2-minute review for this whiskey, and we might be able to link that video below, or just search for it. We're going to be taking this, myself and Solly, one of the guys in the Craft Whiskey Boys, and we're going to taste this and score this out of 10 and see what we think of it. So it's going to be quite interesting. But that's it in a nutshell. That's basically Indian versus Scotch. They're traditionally the same for the single malts in India, not the other stuff that is kind of the bulk of Indian whiskey. That's more traditional to rum. It's fermented molasses, a little bit of maybe 5 or 10%. The rest of it, the other, you know, probably 6 or 7% of Indian whiskey is this really more high-end single malt, much like a Scotch, and they make it much like a Scotch with that one key difference in the temperature and the humidity, which makes it much more difficult to make a whiskey in India than it would in Scotland. But when they do make a whiskey, it's phenomenal. That's another episode. Like it, subscribe if you want to subscribe. If you got some comments, pop them below. We'd love to hear more. We'd love to have a chat and see what you think.